She was not beautiful in the way people expected. Not anymore. The lines at the corners of her eyes didn't lie. Her hair, perfectly cut, didn't hide the strands of gray, and her lipstick was always a little too matte. But he noticed her the first time she stood beneath the rust-stained overhang of the university's art building, tapping her phone like someone trying to pretend they weren't being watched. A red umbrella leaned against her leg. No rain. Just preparedness. She looked like someone who hadn't been surprised in a long time. He'd just finished a critique in the graduate studio, half bored, half hungover, wholly convinced he was smarter than the visiting professor who told him his work lacked emotional honesty. The hell did that even mean? But when he passed her, eyes flicking from the umbrella to the crease between her brows, something strange happened. She looked up, briefly, and then away. No recognition. No flirtation. Nothing. And that, strangely, irritatingly, was what hooked him. He saw her again 2 days later, seated alone at the edge of the campus cafe terrace, nursing a coffee like it had said something offensive. She stared into it the way old painters look at unfinished canvases, daring it to become something it wasn't. Her laptop was open, blank document glaring. A wedding ring sat on her finger like a ghost of intention, not devotion. He recognized the expression on her face, not sadness, not bitterness, but the quieter cousin, resignation. He sat 2 tables away, sketchpad in hand, pretending to work while his pencil barely moved. After 10 minutes, she stood up, closed the laptop slowly, and walked away without finishing her drink. He watched the imprint of her cup on the table, lipstick faint on the rim, and realized he wanted to say something to her. Anything. Not because she was older. Not because she was mysterious. But because, for the first time in months, someone made his skin itch with curiosity. The third time was deliberate. He waited, didn't pretend it was an accident. He saw her walking across the quad in a wool coat too warm for the season, holding a folder tight to her chest like a shield. He stepped directly into her path. Not aggressively. Just enough to startle. "Hey," he said, like he knew her. Like she'd been expecting him. She stopped, frowning. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," he said. "But you left your story at the cafe the other day. The one in the coffee cup." She blinked. Then, somehow, despite herself, she laughed. It wasn't a perfect sound. It caught in her throat and cracked halfway through. But it was real. Honest. And it hit him like a heat wave. "That's a terrible pickup line," she said, lips curling at the edge. "It wasn't one," he lied, "too fast. But it could be." She looked at him again, this time properly. Long enough to notice he wasn't joking. Tall, lean, maybe 25 if he was pushing it. A little arrogant. A little too aware of his face. But not rehearsed. Not rehearsed at all. "Your generation," she said with a sigh, adjusting the folder under her arm. "You all think you're poets with sneakers and bad coffee." "And your generation?" he asked, stepping back to let her pass. She didn't answer. Just walked by, slow enough that he could watch her go but fast enough to remind him, this wasn't an invitation. The game didn't start that day. It started the day after, when he saw her again, this time at the faculty and student mixer no one actually wanted to attend. She stood alone by the drinks table, talking to no one, her glass untouched. He crossed the room in 30 seconds flat and stood beside her like it meant nothing. "They didn't even spring for real wine," he said, gesturing to the table. "Faculty budgets must be rough." She turned, and he could tell she recognized him now. He could also tell she was considering walking away. But she didn't. "They spent it on fake vegan cheese," she said, then nodded toward the exit. "Want to get a drink that tastes like it actually wants to be swallowed?" He followed. They walked to a bar 6 blocks from campus, the kind with low lighting and old jazz looping in the background. She ordered something neat. He ordered something he thought sounded older than he was. They didn't talk about jobs, or art, or how they'd ended up in the same zip code. They talked about cities they didn't miss and movies they hadn't seen. And then, just as the bartender brought her second drink, she said, I haven't laughed like that in years. It wasn't flirtation. It was confession. He leaned in, elbows on the table. You should do it more often. You're better at it than you think. And she smiled, not like she was amused, but like she just remembered she had muscles there. He started looking for her in places she didn't belong. He wandered through faculty corridors, pretending to study flyers on corkboards, listening for the sound of her boots, her steady voice, her habit of clearing her throat before speaking. She never dressed like the others, never in shapeless cardigans or novelty scarves, always in something pressed and clean, like she still believed in being taken seriously. She didn't mention her department, and he didn't ask, but someone told him she taught literature part-time, took on administrative work to pay for her silence in meetings. He wasn't supposed to know her name, but he'd found it printed on the corner of a memo left on a table in the library, Claudia Renner. It sounded like someone from somewhere else, and he liked that. When they saw each other again, it wasn't chance. He waited near the cafe, notebook in hand, acting like he was working while checking his reflection in the screen of his phone. She arrived late, alone, carrying 2 folders and a look that said she'd been talked over one too many times that day. He didn't speak right away. He waited until she'd sat down and opened her laptop, typing for a full minute before noticing him in her periphery. She didn't smile, didn't roll her eyes, didn't even look surprised. She just closed the laptop, stared at him, and said, "This has to stay outside the university." He didn't blink. "Why?" "Because I'm not interested in being anyone's mistake," she said, not unkindly. "And because you're still in the phase where everything feels like a story worth telling." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he nodded toward her folders. "I won't ask. Just buy you another bad coffee." They started meeting in neutral spaces, small restaurants between neighborhoods, bookstores too quiet to be watched, once even a commuter train that ran loops around the city. He never asked about her past, but over time, it leaked through. She mentioned a brother she hadn't spoken to in 6 years. She talked about a colleague who stole her idea for a seminar proposal. She said her ex-husband sent her a card every year, not for her birthday, not for the holidays, just some random day in March, always unsigned. She said this like it was a fact, not a wound. He told her less. He told her about his father's silence and his mother's habit of pretending. He told her about the girl he dated in high school who pretended to love his art but always asked why he never painted happy things. He didn't mention the rumors on campus, the way people whispered about how he was arrogant, or worse, empty. He didn't tell her about the professor who'd called his work derivative during a critique and then tried to add him on social media a week later. He didn't say anything about the way his friends looked at him lately, like they didn't recognize the things he was chasing. One night, as they sat in the corner booth of a narrow bar hidden behind a flower shop, she asked, "Do you think this has a point, or are we just playing dress up with time?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for her hand. She let him. He said, "It doesn't need a point. It just needs to matter." It was the first time she didn't pull away. Things turned the week after when he noticed the stares. It wasn't obvious at first, just a few glances in the hallway, a comment in class about how he was spending a lot of time in the East Building, a friend asking if he was applying for administrative internships. The tone changed when a girl he barely knew from undergrad messaged him late one night with the words, "You know people are starting to talk, right?" He didn't respond, didn't delete the message, didn't even show it to Claudia. Instead, he walked around with a quiet tension in his chest, half waiting for the fallout, half hoping it would burn clean and be done. It wasn't until she called him, voice strained, words clipped, that he understood the rules were no longer theirs. "I got a letter," she said, not bothering with hello. Typed. No signature. Delivered to the department box. He stood in the middle of his kitchen, lights off, one sock on, holding a spoon like it was going to help him. What did it say? That faculty should maintain professional distance from students, she said. That the university has policies on inappropriate relationships. That someone's been watching. His stomach tightened. You think it's real? Not just some scare? It doesn't matter if it's real, she said. It exists. That's enough. Silence stretched between them. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just breathed like someone measuring time by oxygen intake. "I didn't mean for this to make things harder for you," he said, finally. "I thought." "You didn't think," she interrupted, but not cruelly. "That's the problem. You think you're invisible because you're young and no one's watching, but they are. They always are." He could hear the train in the background on her end, that same looping route they'd taken 2 weeks ago, and he knew she wasn't home. He didn't ask where she was. He just said, "Do you want to stop?" She didn't answer for 10 full seconds. Then, "No. But I want to not regret this." He said, "Then we do this on our terms." Her voice was quieter. "And if they take that from us?" "Then we take it back." He didn't know if that was true. But it sounded like a promise worth making. They started speaking only after dark, when the noise of the world dropped low enough for the sound of breathing to mean something. Most nights it was just his voice on the line, talking about nothing until he heard her laugh under her breath or exhale like someone cracking open a window. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, just stayed connected while he painted and she read, the silence between them heavier than anything he could say. He didn't ask what she was reading and she didn't ask what he was painting, and that became a kind of agreement. What they gave each other wasn't explanation, it was space. They didn't meet for almost a week after the letter. She said she was under review for a new committee and couldn't risk showing up on anyone's radar. He understood, but the distance made him restless, and he caught himself staring at people on campus longer than he should have, trying to guess if they were the ones who'd noticed, who'd written, who'd decided they didn't belong. When they met again, it was in a motel off the highway, one she picked because the rooms faced the parking lot and not each other. She didn't kiss him when he arrived. She didn't touch him at all. She just opened the door and sat back on the bed, still dressed in work clothes, legs crossed like she was waiting for an apology that hadn't been asked for yet. He sat down in the chair across from her and said, "You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder with me." She replied, "That's easy to say when no one's asked you to explain yourself yet." They stayed in that room for 2 hours without undressing. He told her about the time his mother threw out all his sketchbooks because she thought they were too dark and didn't want visitors asking questions. She told him about the way her ex-husband stopped talking to her in stages, like it was a system he'd designed to make her disappear in increments. He said, "I don't think this is a mistake." She said, "That's because it's not your reputation they're after." He said, "I'd give up the program if I had to." She looked at him like he'd said something too young to take seriously. By the third meeting, they didn't talk about the letter again. They stayed in the motel every other weekend, always after 9, never before. He paid in cash. She arrived first. He never asked where she was coming from. She never asked where he was going afterward. He started painting differently. Less performative, more specific. His critiques stopped being performances and started being arguments. He told one professor he didn't believe in audience anymore, only accuracy. His friends stopped inviting him to things without giving reasons. He didn't miss them. One night, after she'd fallen asleep beside him, he got up and stood by the window, watching the red neon sign flicker over the empty parking spaces. He wanted to take a photo of her, not because of how she looked, but because she wasn't pretending to be anything. He didn't. He went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until the sun started to rise. They got seen a month later. Not touching. Not even talking. Just walking down a side street 2 blocks from the river, him carrying a bag of groceries, her wearing sunglasses even though the sky was cloudy. A student from his program passed them without breaking stride, but looked long enough that they both felt it. He didn't say anything until they got to her car. She sat behind the wheel and stared at her hands. He said, "That's not proof of anything." She said, "It doesn't need to be." He said, "Do you want to stop now?" She didn't answer. He said, "I'll handle it if it comes back on me." She shook her head, started the car, and said, "It won't." That's not how these things go. They didn't meet the next weekend. She said she had meetings and a migraine. He didn't push. The silence stretched. He painted without her voice in his ear. He went to class and turned in work without commentary. Someone asked if he was all right and he said he was busy. A professor stopped him after critique and said his work was starting to feel distant. He nodded and left the room before the rest of the feedback could land. She called him again 4 days later, just after 11. He didn't say hello. She said, "I missed your voice." He said, "You could have called." She said, "I didn't want to need it." He said, "You can." She said, "Not for long." He sat on the edge of his bed, feet on the floor, phone pressed to his cheek like a secret. He said, "I don't care how this looks to other people." She said, "That's because you still believe things are fair if you explain them enough." He said, "No, I just think we deserve this. Even if it's not permanent. Even if it's complicated." She said, "I don't know what it is." He said, "I'm alive again when I talk to you." She said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, she said, "Me too." They met again the next night, no motel, no plan, just a walk through a construction lot near the river where no one else went after dark. He didn't bring a sketchbook. She didn't wear makeup. They stood beside a pile of cinder blocks and she said, "What if it ends tomorrow?" He said, "Then I'll wake up glad it started at all." She said, "You're not afraid of the cost?" He said, "I'm more afraid of not doing anything real before I turn 30. When they left, they passed the same student from before, standing beneath a streetlight with headphones in. This time, the student saw them. Eyes followed them until they turned the corner. Neither of them spoke until they reached her car. She unlocked it, sat down, looked over at him, and said, "We've been seen now." "You understand that?" He said, "I don't care." She said, "You will." She wasn't wrong. The invitation wasn't meant for him, but she gave it to him anyway. It was for a conference hosted by her department, something formal with a theme about shifting perspectives in contemporary literature, the kind of event where people used words like framework and discourse without blinking. She didn't say why she wanted him to come. She just handed him the folded card across the table at a diner outside the city and said, "You can ignore it if you want." He took it without asking questions, though she could tell by the way he looked at it that he wasn't sure what it meant. She didn't explain. She finished her tea and stood before he could respond. The venue was a hotel conference center filled with small rooms and men in neutral jackets who smelled like old cologne. He arrived late, skipped registration, and stood in the back with a borrowed lanyard. She was sitting on a panel near the front, second from the left, her posture perfect, her tone flat and steady. He didn't hear a word of what she said. He watched the way she avoided eye contact with the audience, the way she clenched the pen in her hand, the way she blinked twice when someone in the front row asked a question. She didn't glance at him once. During the break, he found her near the water station, holding a paper cup and pretending to read a schedule. He stopped 2 steps away and waited for her to speak. She didn't. She just stared at the paper and said, "They asked about us." He said, "Who?" She said, "2 of my colleagues. One of them heard from a student. The other said she saw us leaving a parking lot." He didn't move. She said, "It's not just gossip anymore. It's going to reach the dean's office." He looked around the room at people standing in clusters, trading stories about departments and funding. No one was watching them directly, but he could feel the tension in the air around her, the way her voice had lost its usual control. He said, "Then tell them the truth." She turned toward him slowly. "What truth is that? That I'm old enough to be your mother? That I broke policy because I didn't know when to say no?" He said, "That we care about each other." She laughed once under her breath. "That's not enough. Not in places like this." He didn't follow her into the next panel. He went outside and walked around the hotel twice. He tried to convince himself it was still salvageable, that the people in that room didn't matter, that the rules were only rules if you let them win. When he went back inside, they were serving drinks in the reception hall. He walked in just as someone tapped on a microphone and announced a round of thanks. He saw her near the front, standing beside the department chair, glass in hand, smiling politely. He didn't wait for an opening. He walked across the room in a straight line and stopped a few feet from her. The people around her went quiet before he said a word. She looked at him like she knew exactly what he was going to do. He said, "I won't let them talk about you like this." She said, "Please don't do this here." He said, "Why not? They already decided, didn't they?" She didn't blink. He said, louder now, "You think protecting yourself means pretending this didn't happen, but I won't let you disappear just because they're uncomfortable." Someone cleared their throat behind him. The department chair stepped forward and said, "I think it's best if we discuss this privately." He ignored him. He looked only at her. She said, quietly, "You don't understand what this costs me." He said, "Then tell them." She said, "It won't change anything." He said, "It will change me." She stepped forward, took the glass from his hand, and set it on the table. Then she turned to the room and said, "I've been seeing him. His name is David. He's not a mistake. He's not an error in judgment. He's a person I chose to know." The room didn't move. She said, "If there's a policy problem, I'll answer to it. If there's a personal issue, keep it out of my work. But I'm not ashamed of what this has been." She walked out without waiting for a response. David followed her down the hall, past the restrooms, past the elevators, until she stopped near the side entrance and leaned against the wall with her arms folded. He stood in front of her and said, "You didn't have to say all that." She said, "I did." He said, "Does this mean it's over?" She looked up at him, her face blank. "It means it's not a secret anymore." They drove back in silence. She didn't invite him in when she dropped him off. He didn't ask to come up. They sat in the car with the engine running. He looked at her and said, "So what now?" She said, "Now I see how many people I have to explain myself to." He said, "You don't owe them anything." She looked out the window and said, "That's not how this works. There are rules for women like me. You can ignore them. I can't." He didn't get out of the car. He waited. She said, "You think this is romantic?" "It's not. It's a risk I took because I thought I could handle the fallout." He said, "You can." She said, "That's not the point. The point is, I shouldn't have had to." He got out. She didn't watch him walk away. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in short, quiet messages and cold glances in hallways. Her next committee invitation was revoked without comment. A syllabus she submitted was returned with suggested adjustments that didn't match her field. One colleague stopped replying to her emails. Another smiled at her in meetings but never made eye contact. The student evaluations came in lighter, shorter, with a tone that made her name feel heavier than her title. She didn't speak to David for 2 weeks. He didn't text. He didn't show up. They moved through the same buildings at different times, and she learned to check the windows before stepping out. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself it wasn't punishment. She told herself enough times that she started to believe it. David didn't stop painting. He changed what he painted. He didn't care if anyone liked it. He turned in his final project with no commentary, no explanation, no statement. When asked to explain his shift in direction, he said he no longer painted for an audience that pretended neutrality. He left the room before they finished writing down his grade. He saw her twice from a distance, once near the admin office, once in the back of the library, and both times she looked the same, like she was standing up straight but losing height. He knew better than to interrupt. He wasn't sure if he was part of the problem or just one more thing she had to carry. She didn't cry over it. She didn't drink more or sleep less. She just stopped expecting things to return to how they were. She knew the truth didn't redeem you once you broke the terms people didn't say aloud. There was no policy against what they'd done. There was only structure. There was only expectation. There was only the suspicion that she'd let something in that made the rest of them uncomfortable. She received an invitation to teach 1 course next term instead of 3. The explanation was budget cuts. She didn't reply. She forwarded the email to her personal account and marked it unread. When he finally messaged her, it was not an apology. It was a photo of one of his paintings, unfinished, coarse, and loud with color. She looked at it longer than she meant to. He had never sent her his work before. She stared at the shapes until the email felt like noise. She didn't reply that day. She waited another 3. When she did, she only said, "Is this supposed to be us?" He replied, "No. It's what it felt like after." She didn't know what to do with that. They agreed to meet one more time. Not in the motel, not at his apartment, not in the places where no one knew them. She chose a museum outside the city, one with wide halls and benches no one sat on. He waited near the exhibit with the stone figures, hands in his pockets, not pretending this time. She approached slowly, the sound of her shoes giving her away before she spoke. He turned and looked at her, not surprised but more serious than she remembered. She said, "I don't know what you want from this." He said, "Nothing." She said, "Then why did you ask to see me?" He said, "Because it happened. Because it mattered." She said, "It still does." He nodded. That's the part that's hardest. They walked through 3 rooms without speaking. The art didn't matter. The people didn't either. They stopped in front of a piece with no title, just a number and a plaque. She sat down on the bench and crossed her legs. He stayed standing. She said, "I lost things because of this." He said, "I know." She said, "I still don't regret it." He said, "Neither do I." She looked up at him. "But we can't keep going like it never costs anything." He said, "I don't expect it to be easy." She said, "You expect it to survive." He didn't answer. She said, "What happens when I'm done teaching here? When you graduate? When we're not hiding anymore, but we're not allowed anywhere either?" He said, "Then we figure it out somewhere else." She said, "You always think there's a somewhere else." He sat down beside her. They didn't touch. They didn't look at each other. She said, "I still want you." He said, "I'm still here." She said, "But you won't be forever." He didn't disagree. Outside the museum, the air was warmer than expected. They stood near her car, saying nothing for a while. She unlocked the door but didn't get in. He leaned against the hood, arms folded. She said, "Maybe this was supposed to happen exactly like this." He said, "Maybe it was just supposed to happen." She looked at him. "If we stop, I don't want it to be because we were afraid." He said, "Then let's stop because we're honest." She opened the door and paused. "Would you do it again?" He didn't take long to answer. "Yes." She nodded. She got in and closed the door. He stepped back. She didn't drive away immediately. She sat behind the wheel for a minute, breathing like she was preparing for something that wasn't about to happen but might, eventually. He stood in the parking lot, watching the sky, unsure if the end had already passed or was just arriving. No one said goodbye. No one said wait. What happened next was never written down. It wasn't decided. It was left like that, unfinished, but not unclear.